The eastern hills of the county hold their secrets the way old land always does, in layers and silence, in the patience of things that have learned to wait. A gravel road cuts through cedar so thick the morning light fails before it reaches the ground. Somewhere inside that green wall, 63 acres of forgotten pasture have been sleeping for nearly 40 years. No fences, no structures, no sound except the slow work of brush reclaiming what people abandoned. Then a truck appears at the gate. An older woman steps out alone. No machinery behind her. No crew. Just a worn leather notebook, a canvas jacket faded at the elbows, and the particular stillness of someone who already knows something everyone else has missed. She looks at the wall of cedar and thorn pressing in from every direction. She doesn't flinch. She opens the notebook. Somewhere beneath 40 years of silence, the land is about to answer. The courthouse parking lot held 14 vehicles on the morning of the auction. 3 belonged to county employees. 2 carried reporters from local papers who came out of habit rather than expectation. The rest belonged to people who had driven over mostly to watch the way neighbors gather at the edge of a property fire, not to help, just to witness. The auction room itself smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee, and the folding chairs had been arranged in optimistic rows that were only half filled by the time the auctioneer tapped his microphone twice and cleared his throat. Parcel 19, 63 acres, former pasture ground in the eastern part of the county off a gravel road that hadn't been maintained since the previous decade. The file read like a catalog of abandonment, heavy brush accumulation. No standing structures, no utilities, no reliable access. Delinquent on taxes for 38 years. The estate that had owned it dissolved in stages, heirs, drifting to other states, the land simply left to become whatever land becomes when people stop paying attention to it. The auctioneer read each line without expression, the way a man reads weather data no one asked for. He looked up. The room returned nothing. 14 people sat in chairs and studied their hands or the water-stained ceiling tiles or the middle distance between them and the podium. Someone near the back shifted a boot against the floor. The sound carried. The auctioneer tried again. 63 acres Eastern County opening at assessed tax value, any bid accepted. The overhead light hummed. A woman near the window pressed a tissue to her mouth to suppress a cough. A man in a seed company cap leaned toward his neighbor and murmured something that earned a quiet exhale. Not quite a laugh shaped like one. Then a hand went up in the second to last row. The hand belonged to a woman who had not announced herself to anyone that morning, who had arrived before the coffee finished brewing, taken a seat near the back without speaking to the people around her, set a worn leather notebook on her knee, folded both hands over it, and waited. She was 68 years old, with the kind of stillness that comes not from passivity, but from having decided long ago that most situations resolve better with observation than with speech. Her hair had gone silver at the temples and fully white across the crown, cut short enough to stay out of the way. Her jacket was canvas faded at the elbows. Her boots were the boots of someone who used them. Cecilia Marsh raised her hand, and the auctioneer blinked at her like a man who had stopped expecting the light to come on. Opening bid accepted. He waited the required interval. Nobody else moved. 3 taps of the gavel. The land was hers. Outside, the morning air carried the smell of recent rain on dry limestone, a scent particular to that part of the state in early spring, clean and slightly mineral, the kind of smell that arrives before the heat does. Cecilia stood at the base of the courthouse steps and wrote the confirmation number into her notebook. Her handwriting was precise and unhurried. Harlan Dillard caught up with her before she reached the parking lot. He was 67, built the way men who've spent 4 decades on open acreage tend to be built, broad through the shoulders and slightly forward-leaning, as though always bracing against wind. He had a reputation for plain speaking that he had cultivated over the years like a second crop. You actually bought that place. He wasn't asking. He stopped beside her on the sidewalk, thumbs looped in his belt. Cecilia closed the notebook. I did. Harlan looked back toward the courthouse, then out toward the tree line that marked the eastern hills. There's nothing there, Cecilia. I drove past it 2 weeks ago. Cedar as thick as a fence row blackberry from the road to the ridge. You can't even find the old pasture under all of it. You'll be able to soon enough. He shook his head. The expression on his face was the specific one men wear when they believe they are watching a mistake being made in real time and lack the authority to prevent it. Your husband would have talked you out of this. She looked at him steadily. My husband's been gone 9 years. he doesn't get a vote. She walked to her truck. Near the edge of the lot, partially obscured by a blue pickup belonging to the county assessor's office, a man stood beside a black SUV with the engine running. Roy Gaines was 58, with the tailored look of someone who had once worked outdoors and now worked hard to signal he no longer had to. His jacket was the kind that cost money in a way the label didn't announce. He held a phone loosely in one hand and had been watching the courthouse steps with the particular attention of a man recalculating. He had done his research on parcel 19 3 months prior. The eastern county was growing slowly in the way that rural counties grow without announcement, one subdivision at a time. 63 acres of flat to rolling ground, even overgrown even without utilities, carried potential that the back tax listing didn't mention. He had planned to let the price stagnate through 2 or 3 failed auction cycles before entering with a number that would clear the debt and leave enough margin for a quiet rezoning request. It was the kind of plan that required patience more than capital. Cecilia Marsh had not been part of the calculation. He watched her truck pull out of the lot. Then he unlocked his phone and made a call. Everett Marsh drove. He was 36, Cecilia's sister's youngest son, the one who had ended up staying in the county while his siblings moved towards cities and careers that required more concrete underfoot. He had worked the Marsh Ranch since he was old enough to be useful first summers, then full seasons, then years. He was good with equipment and animals, and the specific kind of problem-solving that comes from having to fix things in the middle of a pasture with whatever happens to be in the truck bed. He was less comfortable with uncertainty, which was why the 40-minute drive back from the courthouse had involved a particular quality of silence. He drove 2 miles before speaking. "What's the plan?" Cecilia looked out the passenger window at fence lines passing. "Rotational browse program, portable electric netting in sections. Start with the heaviest brush concentration on the south slope, work north toward the old fence row." Another mile passed. The gravel county road gave way to blacktop and the truck settled into the sound of open highway. "We're not going to talk about the part where you explain why," Everett said. "You know why." "I know what you've told me before. I'm asking about this particular 63 acres that nobody in that room wanted that your neighbor just told you is a jungle." Cecilia turned from the window. Her voice didn't rise, didn't accelerate. "Harlan Dillard has grazed the same pasture rotation for 22 years without rotating anything. I wouldn't take a land management philosophy from Harlan." That settled the conversation for another few miles. She had bought the Holt place when she was 41, 18 years after her father died, 23 years before Everett was old enough to work beside her. She had grown the Marsh operation across 3 decades of adjustments: bad years, dry years, the year the creek flooded twice, the year cattle prices dropped so low it hurt to look at the books. Through all of it, the land itself had been the thing she returned to when everything else became uncertain. Not the cattle, not the equipment, not the market, the land. What her father had taught her wasn't sentiment. Samuel Marsh had been a practical man, a man of measurements and rotations and careful observation. The lesson he gave her when she was 14 had not arrived wrapped in philosophy. It had arrived in the middle of a neglected pasture on a neighbor's land during a walk she hadn't expected to be instructive. She had pointed at the brush covering the far corner of the field. Dense cedar tangled blackberry, a wall of thorned vine that had advanced 30 yards from the fence in a decade. She told her father someone would need to bring equipment in. He had crouched beside a blackberry cane and looked at it for a long moment before he answered. "Do you know why brush wins?" She gave the obvious answer: nobody cuts it back. Samuel shook his head. He turned the cane over in his hands, looking at it the way he looked at soil samples and hoof conditions, the way he looked at everything that carried information. "Because we keep removing the animals that used to eat it. Brush isn't taking over, it's moving back in. We're the ones who left a vacancy." He stood up and walked on. She had carried that sentence for 54 years. She had tested it against every brushy field she'd encountered, every abandoned pasture, every fence corner choked with cedar. It held up every time. Brush didn't win because it was strong. It won because the thing that checked it had been taken away. The property gate had not been used in years. The hinge post leaned 11 degrees from true, and the wire that had once been a gate now formed an irregular pile at its base, orange with rust. Cecilia stood beside the opening while Everett used a crowbar and a fence stretcher to clear enough space for the truck to pass. Small cedars had seated themselves in the gap, 4 of them, none taller than her shoulder, all of them thick enough at the base to suggest they had been there long enough to be serious about staying. The old ranch road beyond was barely visible. Ruts from a vehicle that had last used it perhaps 15 years prior showed as faint depressions under a layer of dead cedar needle-fallen vine and volunteer grass that had seeded itself in the open strip. Briar canes leaned across from both sides, creating a canopy effect, in places the kind of tunnel that vehicles pass through while everything scratched. Everett drove slowly. The passenger mirror deflected off a cedar branch and snapped back with a sound that made him wince. "If the road's this bad," he started. "The road will clear," Cecilia said. "I was going to say I hope the mirrors survive long enough to find out." She almost smiled. They reached the first open area large enough to turn the trailer around. The brush pressed in on three sides cedars so thick in places that the canopy blocked the morning light. The trunks of older cedars had thickened and dropped their lower branches, leaving a zone of half-light between the ground and the first green growth, like the interior of a building that had been designed by something other than architecture. Everett stepped out of the truck. He stood in the clearing and turned slowly, looking at the walls of brush surrounding them. His expression shifted through several stages before settling into something resigned. "You bought a forest." "Not yet," Cecilia said. She was already walking toward the livestock trailer hitched behind the second truck, which had arrived minutes later. The trailer's occupants announced themselves before she opened the door. There was movement against the panels, the sound of hooves on aluminum flooring, a low collective sound that wasn't quite restless and wasn't quite calm. Everett looked at the trailer. "That's it. That's the equipment." Cecilia lifted the trailer latch. "We brought the equipment yesterday." The first goat appeared at the opening, a Spanish Kiko cross, fawn-colored with dark markings along the spine, the size of a medium dog, but carrying the particular confident energy of an animal that knows its own capabilities. It stepped onto the ground, looked at the surrounding cedar with an expression of frank interest, then moved immediately toward the nearest blackberry cane. The rest followed. 120 goats descended the trailer ramp in a controlled rush, sorting themselves into the clearing with the fluid organization of animals that have done something like this before. They were healthy alert, the kind of alert that showed in the way they held their ears and moved their heads. Within 60 seconds of leaving the trailer, not one of them was paying attention to the grass at their feet. They had turned collectively toward the brush. Everett watched this for a moment. His expression completed its journey from resigned to something closer to reluctant interest. "Of course," he said, not particularly to anyone. The first paddock fence took the afternoon to establish. Portable electric netting, the kind that rolls out in 50-meter lengths, and stakes into the ground with integrated posts divided the south slope into a series of small sections no larger than half an acre each. The system required care corners, had to be secured. Tension had to be, even the energizer had to be grounded properly into soil dry enough to make grounding a negotiation. Cecilia set the last corner post herself, checked the tension along the nearest run, then walked the perimeter once without stopping. The goats followed her progress from inside the first section, watching with the attentive curiosity that is one of the distinguishing qualities of the breed. When she clicked the energizer on and the perimeter held, she stepped back. The transformation that followed was not dramatic in the way people expect when they use that word. There was no machine sound, no exhaust smell, no visible mechanical force. There was only the quiet, methodical work of animals doing what their biology had prepared them across 10,000 years to do. The blackberry vines went first stripped to bare cane within hours. The cedar lower branches went next. The goats worked standing on their hind legs to reach higher growth or pushing through the thicker tangles to access what was on the other side. They ate things that ranchers had spent decades treating as the enemy poison ivy, wild grape multiflora, rose the honeysuckle that strangled fence rows across the county. Everett found Cecilia at the edge of the paddock near dusk. He had been watching for an hour. "They're not touching the grass." "They prefer dessert first," Cecilia said. "They're browsers. They go for the shrubby growth before they'll take grass. That's the whole point. They're doing what they're built for." He picked up a cedar branch they had pulled from the fence line, stripped clean of every needle it had once carried, now looking like something bleached. "I didn't think they'd eat the cedar." "They don't love it, but they'll take it down when there's nothing better." He set the branch back on the ground. "How long?" "To clear a section this size, 4 to 6 days of concentrated browse." He looked at the goats. They were still moving through the paddock as the light faded, working the edges, taking what remained. "And then what?" "Then we moved them." The county heard about it before the week was out. Rural counties have their own communication systems more reliable than newspapers and faster than any official channel sustained by proximity pattern and the collective interest people take in what their neighbors choose to do with their land. By Saturday morning, the information had traveled from the auction room to the coffee shop where it found Harlan Dillard at his usual corner table, folded newspaper in hand, 2 cups already finished. He put down the paper when Dale Pruitt walked in. Pruitt farmed 300 acres north of the river and was the kind of man who repeated things he'd heard as though he'd witnessed them himself. "You hear what Cecilia Marsh bought?" he said, pulling out a chair. Harlan hadn't even finished nodding before Pruitt continued. "She put goats on it. Not cattle, not a brush hog, not any machinery at all. Goats." The man across from Harlan, a retired equipment dealer named Curtis Fenn, looked up. "On the old Carson place, that brushy tax property." "The same." Curtis Fenn set his coffee down. "Good. They'll disappear into that brush before the summer." There was laughter, the particular warm laughter of men who share a long history with the subject at hand. The Parcel 19 land had been discussed in this room before in previous years as an example of what happens when land gets away from people. There was no malice in the laughter. There was also no doubt. Harlan contributed his title to the venture without much effort. "Goat Logging Company," he said, and the phrase landed with the satisfying solidity of a good joke, the kind that doesn't need to be explained. Cecilia walked in 40 minutes later. She did not appear to be in a hurry. She wore the same canvas jacket she had worn at the auction, and she moved through the coffee shop the way she moved through most spaces, taking up exactly the room she needed, nothing more. She went directly to the counter where a rotating display of farm supplies occupied the end section: mineral blocks, dewormers, electrolyte packets. She set 3 50-pound mineral blocks on the counter, added 2 boxes of electrolyte powder, and waited for the woman behind the register to total it. The room had not gone entirely quiet, but it had adjusted. The conversation at Harlan's table had moved to a lower register without anyone appearing to make the decision to lower it. Cecilia paid cash, folded the receipt, set the bags on the hand truck the counter woman brought out, wheeled it toward the door. She looked toward Harlan's table once. Not a confrontational look, not a pointed look. Just the look of someone confirming a location. "Morning, Harlan?" He straightened slightly. "Morning, Cecilia." A pause. "So how's the goat logging company treating you?" She paused at the door with the hand truck. The room had gone fully quiet now, the way rooms go quiet when something is about to happen, and nobody wants to miss it by talking. "They're busy," she said. Then the door closed behind her. The silence lasted a full 3 seconds before Curtis Fenn exhaled. "She heard you," he said. Harlan folded his newspaper with more precision than the task required. "She was always going to hear me." Roy Gaines arrived at the Marsh Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks into the browse program. He had done this deliberately, waited long enough that Cecilia would have encountered the first complications, the learning curve, the moments of doubt that come when any project enters its middle stage, where the beginning energy is spent, but the results aren't visible yet. He had found this to be the most effective time to approach a property owner with an offer. He drove through the ranch gate on the main property, followed the gravel drive to the house, parked the black SUV with the engine off, and got out without hurrying. Cecilia was coming from the direction of the hay barn when he arrived, wearing work gloves, which she pulled off and folded over her belt before he had covered half the distance between them. He gave her the card first. Roy Gaines Land Partners, the logo clean and the paper stock heavy. He spoke with the practiced ease of a man who had made many similar visits. He told her he had admired the Marsh operation for years, that he was familiar with the parcel she had recently acquired, that he had in fact been interested in that property himself. He mentioned the access challenges, the brush accumulation, the costs involved in bringing degraded pasture land back to productive use. Then he named a figure. It was double what Cecilia had paid. She listened without expression, the way she had listened to the auctioneer, the way she listened to most things fully and without interruption. "No," she said. Gaines adjusted his approach without visible discomfort, the sign of a man who had been told no at this stage before. He talked about the potential for partnership arrangements, about the difficulties of managing additional acreage at her stage of operation, about the benefit of converting a speculative purchase to certain cash before significant investment had been made. "Mr. Gaines," Cecilia said, and her tone had not changed in any way that most people would identify as a change. "I didn't buy that land to sell it." He picked up the card she had set on the fence post rather than kept. "What did you buy it for?" She looked out toward the eastern tree line, visible in the distance, the same tree line Harlan Dillard had gestured toward on the courthouse sidewalk, to find out what's underneath. He drove back down the gravel road without having agreed to anything. From the rearview mirror, the lane straightened before curving left toward the main road. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to contact the county planning office. The land had value he hadn't fully calculated yet. He had learned that much from the conversation. The county extension grazing specialist came out during the 6th week of the browse program on a Thursday morning when the light was still low enough to turn the recovering sections gold. His name was Todd Halbrook, and he had spent 22 years doing field work across the county's agricultural lands, which meant he had seen most things at least once. He carried a clipboard and an expression of professional neutrality that was his default when visiting operations he had not previously observed. He had privately formed an opinion about the browse program before arriving. It was the opinion a man with his experience tends to form when he hears that someone has deployed goats on 40 years of unmanaged brush growth, possible as a first-pass tool and practical as a primary strategy, unlikely to produce meaningful results in a single season. He didn't share this opinion. He wrote it in his notes under the heading Pre-Observation Assessment, which was the polite way he documented his prior assumptions before evidence had the opportunity to revise them. He parked at the gate and walked the first completed paddock alone before finding Cecilia. The section covered 3 acres on the south-facing slope below the old ranch road. 6 weeks ago, by the photographs Cecilia had provided in advance, this section had been wall-to-wall cedar and blackberry tangle, the kind of growth that most operators would have addressed with a forestry mulcher and a significant fuel bill. The before photographs had shown a green mass so complete that the ground beneath was not visible from any angle. What Todd Halbrook walked through that morning was different in a way that required him to stop moving for a moment. The cedar stood stripped to their structural branches, looking architectural in the early light, their silhouettes cleanly visible now that the needle mass had been consumed or knocked. The blackberry canes remained upright, but bare stripped to their thorn stems, the kind of thorough defoliation that even professional brush crews rarely achieved because they addressed the plant at the canopy rather than eating through it from every direction simultaneously. The multiflora rows had been taken to the ground in places. But what stopped him was not the stripped brush. What stopped him was what was growing underneath it. Native grasses had emerged across the floor of the section in a texture that looked at first glance like an installation rather than a natural process. Cidoates, grama, little bluestem wild bergamot, a species of pasture sedge he didn't immediately identify. They were not large a week's growth, perhaps 2 weeks, but they were there, green, organized, their spacing and variety suggesting not random seeding from adjacent areas, but emergence from a seed bank that had been waiting viable under the canopy for longer than the brush had been there. Wildflower stems. Young oak seedlings, several of them, some reaching ankle height, which meant they had germinated within the past season and survived because light had finally reached them. He found Cecilia at the fence line of the second paddock checking the netting tension. She heard him coming across the open section and didn't turn until he was close. Todd Halbrook was not a man given to theatrical statements. He said what he had seen with the flatness of a technical report. "I wasn't expecting this." "What were you expecting?" "I expected the brush to be gone. That part tracks with what I know about managed browse. I did not expect the understory." He looked back at the section. "That's a native seed bank. It's been dormant under that canopy. You didn't plant any of this." "No, it was waiting." He turned the phrase over like he was testing its accuracy. "The sunlight reached it, and it activated. This is a soil restoration event, not just a brush clearing event." He made a notation on the clipboard. "How long has that canopy been in place?" "Close to 40 years. The seed bank survived 40 years under that canopy. Apparently." He looked across the section again at the stripped cedar standing in gold morning light, at the low green texture of returning grasses beneath them. His clipboard came down to his side. "This isn't dead land," he said. The words came out with the weight of a revision. "This is sleeping land." It was the first week of summer. The goats had moved to the third section of the south slope. They wouldn't run out of work before September. Harlan Dillard didn't stop by to ask questions. He drove past on his way from one field to another, the way he had driven past for years on the county road that bordered the eastern edge of Parcel 19. He had driven past the week before the auction and the week after it, and every week of the browse program, because it was on the route between his home place and his north field. He drove past on a Thursday afternoon in early summer, the same week Todd Halbrook had filed his extension notes. The window was down because the day was warm and the cab hadn't cooled since he'd stopped for diesel 2 hours prior. He slowed before he meant to. The section visible from the road was one Cecilia had completed in week 4. 6 weeks of recovery since the goats had moved through. The cedars still stood, but they had been reduced from a wall to a structure, individual trees rather than a mass, their spacing now visible, and their silhouettes legible against the sky. Beneath them, across the ground that had been invisible from this road for as long as Harlan could remember, something green was moving in the light afternoon wind. It wasn't much, not yet. It wasn't the pasture it would become. But it was there, and it hadn't been there before, and Harlan Dillard pulled his truck to the shoulder and sat for a moment longer than the view strictly required. He had farmed this county for 41 years. He had seen plenty of things go wrong, fewer things go right, a small number of things go in a direction nobody anticipated. He sat with his arm on the window opening and looked at the green, moving in the stripped cedar shadow, and the expression on his face was not the one from the courthouse sidewalk. It was something slower, more uncertain, the look of a man revising a calculation without yet knowing what the new figure will be. He drove on. Cecilia watched from the far side of the paddock where she had been monitoring the goats in the 4th section. She didn't wave. She watched the truck slow stop, then continue down the road. The evening light came across the hills from the west, warm and horizontal, touching the tops of the stripped cedar first and working its way down. The goats moved through their work in the 4th section without drama, unhurried, thorough, systematic in the way of animals that don't have a second plan and therefore don't need one. Everett found her there near dark. He brought 2 thermoses, set one on the fence post. They stood at the netting edge and looked across what had been accomplished. The south slope, which had been an undifferentiated mass of green when they arrived in spring, now showed topography. The ridgeline was visible. The shallow drainage swale that ran diagonally across the section showed as a slight depression in the ground, the kind of feature that tells you something about how the land was formed. The old fence post stumps were visible at irregular intervals, gray wood softened by decades of weather, patient as everything else out here. Everett wrapped both hands around his thermos. Todd Halbrook's report went to the county newsletter. Did you know that? Cecilia nodded. He used the words significant dormant seed bank activation. He said it was one of the most complete native understory recoveries he'd observed through managed browse. Everett paused. Harlan Dillard subscribes to the county newsletter. She drank her coffee. I'm just saying, Everett said, words getting around. The darkness came up from the low places. First, the way it always does in open country, filling the swells and the depressions before it reached the high ground. The goats settled into their quiet evening sounds. The stripped cedar held the last light at their crown, standing in the fading gold like something the land had been building toward all along. Cecilia Marsh had paid no attention to what the county thought when she bought the land. She intended to pay no more attention to it now that the county had changed its mind. What mattered was the seed bank in the soil. The returning grass, the topography becoming visible again after 40 years of being hidden. What mattered was what was underneath. She had come to find out what that was. She was just getting started. Autumn came to the eastern county the way it usually did, without ceremony. One morning, the light arriving at a different angle, and the air carrying a weight that hadn't been there the day before. The hills changed color over the course of 2 weeks, the oaks going copper, and the remaining cedars deepening their green. By contrast, the whole landscape clarifying itself the way things do when the growing season releases its grip. Across Parcel 19, the change was more fundamental than color. By the first week of October, the goats had worked through 37 of the 63 acres. The south slope was fully open. The west-facing ridge above the old ranch road was 3/4 cleared. The section along the drainage swale had been completed in late August, when the goats had dismantled the thicket there with a thoroughness that surprised even Cecilia. She walked those areas now the way a person walks through a room after furniture has been rearranged, recalibrating the space, taking in what the new openness revealed. Old fence posts appeared at intervals that told a story about how the land had been divided and used before the brush took over. Not the portable netting posts Everett had driven this season, but the original one's cedar posts cut from the property itself, probably darkened by decades of weather to a gray that matched the limestone outcroppings on the higher ground. Some still held their wire, multiple strands wrapped around the wood rusted to a color just short of red. One section of original fence line ran 90 yards along the south edge of the drainage swale, straight as a surveyor's line, still standing, still plumb, within a few degrees of vertical. 40 years of abandonment had tried to erase what people built here. It had not entirely succeeded. The old ranch road, barely traceable in the spring, now showed itself in two directions from the central clearing. The western branch curved toward the county road. The eastern branch climbed the ridge, disappearing into the remaining brush at the upper tree line where the goats hadn't yet reached. In the cleared sections, the original road surface appeared as two parallel depressions worn into the subsoil, something between a trace and a track, the kind of mark that requires a vehicle to pass over ground 10,000 times before it becomes permanent. Someone had used this road for a very long time ago. Everett walked the eastern branch on a Saturday morning, following it from the clearing up the ridge as far as the remaining brush would allow. Where the brush closed in, he stopped. The trace of the road continued into the cedar, visible as a slightly lower corridor. In the canopy, the kind of corridor that forms when something has interrupted growth in a narrow strip for long enough that the trees on either side have accommodated the absence. He took photographs with his phone. When he showed them to Cecilia that afternoon, she studied them without speaking, then set the phone face down on the truck hood. "What's up that road?" he asked. "Something," she said. "We'll get there." Wendell Cobb drove a truck that was older than some of the fence posts on the property. He was 74, the county's unofficial historian, in the way that certain men become the repository of local knowledge through the combination of long tenure, obsessive interest, peculiar memory, and a filing system that nobody else could navigate. He had been the County Historical Society's president for 11 years, stepped down to take the title of research director, which meant he continued doing exactly what he'd always done, except without the administrative responsibilities. He arrived in the second week of October carrying a cardboard tube, the kind that holds rolled documents secured at both ends with rubber bands that had seen better decades. He had heard about the Marsh Browse program through the county newsletter, through the extension report that Todd Halbrook had submitted through Harlan Dillard, mentioning it at a church function, through the accumulation of channels by which news traveled in a county where most people had known most other people for most of their lives. He also had information. He spread the contents of the tube across the tailgate aerial photographs, two of them, black and white, printed on the kind of paper that photographic prints from that era used, matte surfaced, faded at the edges to a yellow-white. One was dated 1954 in the lower right corner, stamped with the County Agricultural Office seal. The other had no date, but its resolution and tonal quality placed it somewhere in the same decade. In both photographs, Parcel 19 was visible as an agricultural operation. Cleared fields, fence lines precise enough to show as thin, dark lines from the altitude. Structures in the lower quarter of the parcel, a cluster of 3 or 4 buildings, the kind of arrangement that rural homesteads produce main structure outbuilding. Smaller outbuildings arranged around a central working area. On the east ridge, clearly visible in the 1954 photograph, and slightly less clear in the earlier one, a distinct pattern in the canopy. Wendell set his finger on it without touching the surface of the print. "Do you see the spacing there on the ridge below the upper tree line?" Cecilia leaned in. The pattern was regular, the kind of regularity that doesn't appear in natural growth trees at consistent intervals. Canopy touching but not merging, arranged in rows that the angle of the photograph made legible. "That's an orchard," she said. Wendell nodded. "Carson family. I found a reference in the county agricultural census from 1897. They listed apple production, quince 1 entry that reads simply, orchard trees various. The census entry puts the orchard on the east ridge of the property." He looked toward the ridge where the upper tree line still held. "I believe it's still up there." Cecilia looked at the photographs for another moment. Then she looked at Everett. He was already looking at the ridge. The goats reached the east ridge in the third week of October. The section up there was denser than the lower slopes, the blackberry thickets compacted by years of growth on growth new canes, threading through old ones, until the mass had a structural quality, a resistance that required the goats to work differently than they had on the open slopes below. They pushed into the edges, retreated, found the soft points return. Progress was slower. 2 days into the section, Cecilia rotated in a fresh group from the completed south slope paddocks, doubling the browse pressure on the thickest concentration. On the 4th day, Everett was walking the perimeter of the ridge section when he stopped. He stopped because what he was looking at didn't match the context. Everything in that ridge section was the same tangled blackberry cedar pressing in from the north. Wild grape looping through everything, the thorn disorder of 40 years without management, except for what was directly in front of him, which was a trunk. A trunk too large in diameter and too deeply furrowed to belong to any of the cedar or wild plum that shared the section. The bark pattern was different. The trunk branched lower than a forest tree, with the main limbs spreading outward rather than reaching upward, the architecture of something that had been trained over generations to produce rather than compete. He called for Cecilia. She came through the paddock netting at the corner and crossed the cleared ground to where he stood. She looked at the trunk. She looked up. The canopy above them, stripped of its blackberry overgrowth by the goats working the section, revealed something that the vines had been hiding. A branch structure. The gnarled, horizontally spreading limbs of an old apple tree, twisted by decades of fighting for light against the encroaching brush branches, angling in directions that reflected the negotiated path they had found to the sky. The tree had not given up. It had found its way through. Beyond it, another trunk, then another. The goats were still working, and with each hour that passed, the blackberry fell back further from the base of each tree, and the orchard revealed itself not all at once, but in stages, one tree then the next, each one requiring a moment of recognition before the next appeared, the way figures emerge from a crowded background when the eye finally finds its focus. 11 trees in the main section, 4 more slightly downslope, all of them alive. The smallest of the living trees was still larger around the trunk than Everett's 2 hands together. The largest had a trunk diameter that suggested it had been established well before 1894, possibly before 1890, possibly before any specific date they would ever be able to confirm. Some of them had broken limbs where weight had overcome the wood's tolerance, dead sections, gray and punky, splitting at the joints. But the living wood continued past the dead sections, finding its way around the damage producing at the branch tips, the small, tight clusters that Cecilia recognized as fruit. She reached up to one cluster. The apples were small, not the grocery store variety of large and uniform, but small and slightly irregular, their skin a yellow-green with a blush of dull red, where the occasional light had found them through the vine canopy. She took one. The taste was sharp, almost aggressive, with a sweetness underneath that arrived late and lasted. Wild in the way that things grown without intervention are wild truer to what the original stock had been before cultivation smoothed it. Everett was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before, the sound of a man encountering something that revises his understanding of where he is. I didn't know these were here. Cecilia looked at the tree in front of her, at the survivor quality of it, at the branches angling through the decades of darkness toward the light they had never entirely stopped reaching for. Nobody did, she said. That's different from being gone. Wendell Cobb came back when he heard about the orchard. He brought a second tube of photographs, these newer than the first set county assessment records from 1962, the last year the Carson property had been formally assessed as an active agricultural operation. The records listed orchard acreage, 15 trees, the same number Cecilia had found. He walked among them, slowly touching trunks with the flat of his hand, reading the bark the way a man reads a text he has been anticipating for a long time. At the base of the oldest tree, he crouched and examined the root flare, the place where the trunk met the soil, always the most honest part of a tree's history. These were established before 1890, he said. He didn't make it a question. The trunk diameter, the root system, the branching pattern. These trees are older than any living person in this county. He stood, looked at the orchard as a whole. The Carson family built something here, a real homestead, not just a house and a barn. They built a water system and orchard, a working operation that expected to last. He looked at Cecilia. Somewhere on this property there should be a well. Every operation like this had one. The aerial photographs show a spring house in the lower cluster of structures. He gestured vaguely toward the middle section of the property, the area the goats hadn't reached yet. If the spring house is still there, the well should be near it. Cecilia listened. She looked at the orchard, at the 15 trees standing in the new light of a cleared October morning. She made no prediction about what else was under the remaining brush. She had learned in the spring that the land would show her on its own schedule. Pushing that schedule had never been her method. Roy Gaines filed his complaint with the County Planning Commission on the 14th of October. The document was 4 pages prepared by a firm whose letterhead listed an address in the state capital. It alleged that the browse operation being conducted on Parcel 19 constituted commercial agricultural activity requiring a conditional use permit under the county's Land Use Ordinance Section 7, subsection C, which governed operations of a scale or character not consistent with personal subsistence use. It cited the number of animals, the acreage under management, the Extension Service report that had been published in the county newsletter, which Gaines's attorney had highlighted and attached as an exhibit. The complaint requested that the county issue a stop work order pending a permitting review estimated to take 60 to 90 days. Cecilia received the notice on a Thursday. She read it twice at the kitchen table, set it on the counter, went back outside to check the paddock rotation she had been monitoring before the mail came. She pulled the Energizer connection on the east section, moved the netting reset. The corner post reconnected the Energizer, checked the tension. She moved the goats. Everett found the notice on the counter that evening. He read it once. He's trying to stop the operation. He's trying to delay it, Cecilia said. Different goal. What's the difference? She set down the rotation log she'd been updating. Stopping it means he thinks he can win. Delaying it means he's running the clock. He wants me to get tired. She picked up the log again. I don't get tired. She called the county planning office the following morning, asked to speak with the director, was told the director was in a meeting, left a message that contained her name, a callback number, the parcel number in question, the date of acquisition, the tax payment receipt number, the permit exemption, code that applied to livestock. Browse operations on parcels under 100 acres in the county's agricultural zone in the specific subsection of the ordinance that Gaines's complaint had failed to cite. The director called back inside 40 minutes. The complaint would be reviewed as all complaints were reviewed. The exemption code Cecilia had cited was valid and applicable. A stop work order was not warranted under the current filing. Gaines's firm would receive a response within the standard 10 business day window. She went back out to check the goats. The complaint had cost Gaines a legal fee. It had cost Cecilia a phone call. The land hadn't noticed either. The green strip appeared in the second week of November. Everett found it on a Tuesday morning on the section between the restored South Slope paddocks and the area approaching the Orchard Ridge. He had been walking that ground to assess the recovery in the sections the goats had completed 6 weeks prior, checking the native grass density, looking for erosion patterns along the drainage swale. The morning was cold, dry, the kind of cold that carries no moisture. The sky a pale blue with no cloud definition. He was looking at the swale when something in his peripheral vision pulled his attention east. A strip of grass no more than 4 feet wide, running northeast from somewhere in the middle of the property toward the orchard section. The strip was not remarkable in color, the same late autumn brown gold as the surrounding recovered pasture. What was remarkable was that the surrounding pasture had gone dry and dormant 2 weeks prior, when the last measurable rainfall had fallen. The region had seen nothing since. The strip had not gone dormant. The grass in it was not dead season brown. It was green, actively green, the kind of green that indicates available moisture in soil that the surrounding ground clearly did not have. He followed it. The strip ran for nearly 270 yards before disappearing beneath a blackberry thicket on the northeast slope, one of the sections the goats hadn't reached. He knelt at the edge where the green strip met the thicket. The soil under the grass was noticeably cooler than the soil 6 feet away. He pushed his fingers into it. Damp. Not wet, not waterlogged, but holding moisture in a way that the surrounding soil was not. Something was moving water through this corridor. Something underground, or something just at the surface, something that the brush above was hiding. He went back for Cecilia. She walked the strip with him that afternoon, the full 270 yards. She knelt at intervals, pressed her hands to the ground, felt the difference in temperature. At the upper end of the strip, where it disappeared into the thicket, she stood for a long moment looking at the angle of the ground. It's running downhill, she said. Just barely. You can't see it walking, but the grade is there. Everett looked from the thicket to the lower end of the strip where it terminated at the base of a cedar cluster they had cleared in August. Running from where to where, from up there, she pointed toward the uncleared northeast slope. To the orchard, or to where the orchard was when this was built. He looked at her. When what was built? She didn't answer, but her expression had the quality of something being confirmed rather than discovered. She had not known this was here. She had not expected it. But she recognized what it meant in the way that someone who has spent 68 years paying attention to land recognizes the signature of intention beneath the surface of apparent nature. This was not accidental. The goats reached the northeast slope thicket in the last week of November. The cold had slowed their output slightly the way cold slows everything biological, but it had not stopped them. They worked the thicket's edges first the way they always did, finding the accessible material and taking it before pressing deeper. The blackberry canes, stripped of their leaves weeks earlier by frost, stood dry and rattling, now easier to access than they had been in summer. Their thorns unchanged, but their resistance reduced to structure without mass. Within 4 days of entering the section, the thicket had been reduced by half. On the 5th day, in the late afternoon, when the light was coming in low and the stripped canes were casting long shadows across the ground, Everett saw it. He had been walking the section boundary, checking the netting on the north run, when the shadows made something visible that the direct light had obscured. 2 parallel lines running along the ground, separated by approximately 18 inches, composed of something darker than soil. He stepped over the netting into the section, walked toward the lines, crouched. Stone. Flat stones, the same gray limestone that formed the backbone of the county's geology, fitted side by side in 2 parallel rows, with a shallow concavity between them, the concavity about 10 inches across at its widest, curving slightly inward. A channel. The stones had been set with care, their flat surfaces angled slightly inward and downward, creating a profile that would direct any water moving through the channel toward the center and down the grade. He followed the channel. It ran in the same direction as the green strip he had followed in November, the same gentle northeast to southwest descent, aimed across the cleared ground toward the orchard section below. He followed it for 40 feet before the thicket closed over it again, goats having not yet reached the interior of the section. He stood up and called for Cecilia with a volume he had not used since the spring, when the netting energizer had thrown a fault and he'd needed her to kill the power from the truck. She came at a pace that was not quite a run, but was not her normal walk. He pointed at the channel. She crouched beside it, ran 2 fingers along the inner surface of the stone, brought her fingers up, looked at them. The limestone was cool, damp in the way the green strip soil had been damp. She followed the section he had followed, then stood. Hand-set limestone. Her voice was level, but there was something in it that was not level. Something that arrived when language tries to contain information that is larger than the words available. These were fitted. This is not a drainage feature. This was designed. Everett looked from the channel to the cleared ground below toward the orchard. To move water. To move water without a pump. Gravity only if the grade is right. She straightened. If this connects to a water source uphill from the orchard, it watered the entire homestead. The orchard, the garden beds, the livestock. All of it without a diesel engine, without electricity, without anything except elevation. The goats moved through the thicket around them, efficient, unhurried. The last light of the November afternoon touched the stone channel with the directness of low-angle winter sun. Wendell Cobb. When Cecilia called him, drove out the following morning. He walked the exposed section of channel without speaking for several minutes. Then he said what the silence had already said. Gravity-fed water race. His voice carried the weight of someone naming something they had only read about but never seen intact. I have a reference in the 1889 County Agricultural Report. A correspondent described the Carson operation as having an admirably contrived water system stone-laid, requiring no mechanical assistance. I thought it was the kind of praise men gave to ordinary things when they were trying to sound educated. He looked at the channel. It wasn't. He explained what Cecilia already suspected. A gravity-fed water race was a stone-lined channel built along a precise grade, the calculation done by eye, and experience rather than instrument, the grade shallow enough that water moved without erosion, but steep enough that it moved at all. If the source was a spring or a well at sufficient elevation, a well-built race could carry water hundreds of yards to wherever it was needed. The Carson family had built one. The Carson family had built it well enough that it still existed under 40 years of brush intact, waiting for the brush to come off and the grade to do what grade always does. If there's a race, Wendell said, there's a source. It has to start somewhere uphill. He looked toward the upper northeast slope where the thicket was densest, where the goats hadn't reached, where the brush was oldest. The well is up there, he said. Cecilia didn't rush toward the upper slope. She moved the goat rotation through the sections that were scheduled in the order they were scheduled, the way she had managed the entire operation. The northeast thicket was on schedule for late January. It would be cleared on schedule. Gaines submitted a second inquiry to the county commission in December, this one requesting clarification of the property's zoning classification and inquiring whether a water resource of historical significance had been identified on the parcel. He framed it as a question of public interest. His attorney had been doing research. The commission replied that no formal resource identification had been submitted. The property remained classified as agricultural. The inquiry was noted. Cecilia received a copy of the inquiry through the standard notification process for adjacent and interested property parties, which Gaines had listed himself as citing his prior expression of purchase interest. She read it. She filed it. She went back out to the paddocks. Everett noticed the pattern in the inquiries. The first had been about permitting attempting to stop the operation. This one was about the water. Gaines had found out about the channel. How does he know? Everett asked. Cecilia set down the rotation log. Counties don't keep secrets. Todd Halbrook filed an extension report. Wendell talks to people. Word moves. She looked toward the northeast slope. He's recalculating. He knows this land is worth more than he thought. That doesn't bother you. The question hung in the cold December air for a moment. Cecilia looked at the frost on the south paddock grass, at the orchard ridge above, at the pale winter sky over the upper slope where the well they hadn't found yet was waiting in the brush exactly where it had been for 130 years. He can know what it's worth, she said. That doesn't change what it is. January was cold. The goat rotation paused for 10 days during the stretch, when the temperature dropped below 20 each night, and the portable netting became difficult to work with in frozen ground. The animals wintered in the barn returned to the property when the break came, settled back into their work without any visible opinion about the interruption. The upper northeast section opened in the last week of January. Everett climbed the ridge on a Thursday morning before the light was fully up, carrying a thermos, working off the habit he had developed over months of early checks before the day's rotation began. The cold was still present, the kind of dry cold that follows a clear night, and the ground was firm underfoot. He reached the top of the ridge and turned to look back at the valley. The land below him was changed in a way that the change of any individual week had not prepared him for. When he looked at it now, assembled in the low morning light, the cleared sections spreading from the south slope up to the orchard ridge and east toward where he stood, he saw a shape. Not the shape of brushland, not the amorphous green mass of 40 years of unmanaged growth. A shape with topography, with logic, with the evidence of human intention in the fence lines and the stone markers and the old road trace. A working landscape, or what had once been one. He turned back toward the upper section. The goats were already in it, the new rotation having been released at first light. The frost-stiffened blackberries stood in clusters, the canes rattling when the animals pushed through. The light came across the ridge from the east, just clearing the tree line on the county road. He was looking toward the north end of the section when it stopped him. Not movement, not sound, a shape in the morning mist that had settled in the low spots after the cold night. A circle, a ring. Approximately 4 feet across the outer circumference, composed of something gray and regular that the mist made uncertain, barely visible above the frozen ground. He went down the ridge at a pace that was not careful. He crossed the cleared section, ducked the paddock netting, reached the circle. Gray limestone, hand-fitted. The individual blocks were rectangular, not quarried in the modern sense, but hand-cut their surfaces bearing the marks of tools that were not power tools. They were arranged in a circle roughly 48 inches across the joints between them, tight, the coursing visible as individual layers stacked to a height of perhaps 8 inches above the current ground surface, though the ground had clearly built up around the outside of the structure over decades of accumulated leaf matter and debris. He knelt at the edge. He leaned forward. Cool air moved against his face, rising from below. The thermos went down on the ground beside him without his noticing. He went back down the ridge at a controlled sprint. Cecilia reached the stone circle 20 minutes later. She crouched at the edge. The cool air was unmistakable, the kind of cool that doesn't come from stone alone, that comes from depth. She listened. The mist had not yet burned off, the morning still holding its blue-gray, the frost in the open sections, beginning to release their moisture in thin vapor. She listened past that. Water. Not flowing, not loud. The faint acoustic signature of a contained space with water present the sound that a well makes when a person leans close and the world above goes quiet enough to hear what's below. She brushed leaves and decades of debris from the top of the stone ring. The construction became clearer as the surface cleared, dry-laid limestone fitted without mortar, each block selected for the way it met its neighbors. The craftsmanship was not incidental. Someone had understood this work, had done it with the knowledge of a person who expected it to last, who expected someone in the future to lean over the same edge and hear the same sound. Wendell Cobb arrived that afternoon with a rolled map. He had been waiting, he told her, for the right moment to bring out. The map was a surveyor's plat from 1891, not the original, a photocopy of a photocopy, the lines slightly uncertain, but the structures marked on it: legible house, site, barn, footprint, outbuilding cluster. A small square symbol near the upper northeast slope, labeled in period handwriting, too small to read clearly, until Wendell held his magnifying glass over it. Carson. Well, the label read. He looked from the map to the stone circle. His expression was the expression of a man who has spent 50 years searching for a door and has just heard a key turn in the lock. "I've had this map for 11 years, he said. "I knew the well was somewhere on this property. I didn't know if it survived." The well contractor came the following morning. He brought a truck with a mounted light system, the kind used for inspection of existing structures, capable of illuminating down long confined spaces. He lowered the light on its cable. Everyone leaned over the stone rim. The beam descended into darkness. 10 feet, 20. The walls were visible as the light passed the same hand-fitted limestone continuing below the surface. The coursing straight, the construction quality consistent all the way down. 30 feet, 40. At 52 feet, the light hit water. The surface shimmered in the beam, absolutely clear, no color, no turbidity. The contractor measured with the cable's marked intervals, 20 feet of water depth. He pulled the light back up without speaking for a moment. "Then that well is full, not low water level full. Full. 20 feet is a strong aquifer draw for this geology." He looked at the stone ring, at the limestone walls that disappeared into the earth. "Whatever feeds this hasn't stopped. Not in 130 years. Cecilia looked down into the darkness below the stone rim. The cool air continued to rise from the water below. She thought about the race channel on the lower slope, about the green strip that had stayed green through the dry weeks of autumn, about the orchard trees that had survived without tending, because something had kept moisture moving through the soil of that ridge, even when no one was watching. The well had not failed the land. The land had simply lost the people who knew to use it. Wendell looked at her over the stone rim. "Gaines knows about the channel. When he finds out about this—" "He'll find out," Cecilia said. The cool air rose around her hands where they rested on the old limestone. "Let him." She was already thinking about what the water contractor would tell her about flow rate and recharge. She was already calculating the grade between the well and the stone channel below, the distance to the orchard, the distance further down to the lower paddocks, the simple, elegant, unelectrified arithmetic of elevation doing work. The envelope arrived at the ranch mailbox 4 days after the well contractor filed his inspection report with the county water office, which was a matter of public record. Gaines's firm had been monitoring the county water office filings. The envelope was thick, the paper inside heavy, the figure at the top of the offer sheet 5 times what she had paid at auction. Cecilia read it at the kitchen table. She set it on the surface. She picked up the phone, called the number on the letterhead, reached an assistant, asked for Gaines. He came on within a minute, which told her he had been waiting for the call. She didn't negotiate. She didn't explain. She told him the offer was declined, that no future offers would receive different consideration, that he was welcome to pursue other properties in the county where his interests might align with a willing seller. She thanked him for his time. She ended the call. Everett was leaning against the counter when she set the phone down. He looked at the offer sheet on the table. 5 times, he said. Cecilia set the offer sheet on the counter and turned back toward the window that faced east toward the ridge, where the well was, toward the orchard below it, toward the stone channel that connected one to the other, in a system someone had built with their hands in a time before anyone living had been born. Outside, the goats were working the last section of uncleared brush on the upper northeast slope, the section adjacent to the well. By the end of the week, it would be open. By spring, the whole 63 acres would be standing in light. "He wants land he can sell," Cecilia said. Her voice had the quality of a statement that had been true before she spoke it. "What we found here isn't that kind of land anymore." The restoration of the well began on a Monday in February, when the ground was firm enough to work without losing footing on the ridge, the frost still in the upper inch of soil each morning, but the afternoons carrying enough warmth to make the limestone pleasant to handle. Cecilia started alone. She had looked at the well structure for 3 weeks before she touched it. This was her method with things that deserve careful consideration. Observation first, long enough to understand what you were looking at before your hands formed an opinion. The stone ring at the surface had held its position through 40 years of frost cycles, through the weight of accumulated brush pressing in from every direction, through the indifference of every season that had passed since the last human hand had rested on it. It had held because it was built correctly. Restoration meant understanding that correctness before adding to it. The debris around the exterior came off first. Decades of leaf accumulation, fallen cedar limbs, the matted root mass of blackberry that had pressed against the outer wall, the kind of organic layer that builds silently at the rate of a quarter-inch per year until the structure beneath it becomes archaeology. She removed it by hand, not because machines weren't available, but because hands could feel what machines couldn't, could tell the difference between debris and displaced stone, could sense the point at which removal became disturbance. 3 stones on the northeast quadrant of the ring had shifted. Not collapsed, not fallen inward, simply moved outward by the slow hydraulic pressure of frozen soil, expanding against the exterior wall over many winters. Each one could be moved back by a single person who understood the geometry of dry-laid limestone, which is a geometry of weight distribution rather than adhesion, the stones holding each other through position rather than chemistry. Cecilia moved the first stone back into its original seat on a Tuesday morning, the second on Wednesday. The third required her to remove 2 adjacent stones to understand the original placement pattern before she could re-establish it, which she did on Thursday afternoon. Everett came up the ridge on Friday and found her standing back from the completed section looking at it. The restored quadrant was indistinguishable from the original construction. The joints were tight, the coursing was level. The surface plane of the ring was continuous again, the way it had been when someone whose name was now only in county records had set the last stone and stepped back and felt what Cecilia was feeling now, which was the satisfaction of a thing being what it was supposed to be. "You could have had the contractor do this," Everett said. Cecilia didn't look away from the well. "The contractor would have done it right. That's not the same as doing it correctly." He thought about that for a moment. "Is there a difference? The contractor would have brought mortar." She finally looked at him. "These stones have held each other for 130 years without mortar. They don't need it now. They need someone who understands why they don't need it." The envelope from Gaines's legal firm arrived on a Thursday in late February, thicker than the previous correspondence, the paper inside representing more billable hours than the earlier filings. Cecilia read it at the kitchen table with the same expression she brought to extension reports and rotation schedules, the expression of a person extracting information without yet forming a response. The argument was novel in its framing. Gaines's attorneys had shifted from permitting challenges which had failed to what they were calling a public resource conservation claim. The essence of it was this: a water feature of historical and community significance had been identified on Parcel 19. Wells of this age and construction quality, they argued, were rare in the county, potentially in the state. The public interest in preserving access to historical agricultural water infrastructure superseded private property rights to develop or exclusively control such resources. They were not claiming ownership. They were claiming that public conservation status should be applied, which would require county oversight of the well potential public access provisions, a management board that would include community representatives. The signature on the filing was not Gaines's own. He had found a co-petitioner, a county resident named Burl Stackhouse, who had a stated interest in county historical preservation. Wendell Cobb, reached by phone, told Cecilia he had never heard of Burl Stackhouse in 11 years of County Historical Society work. She asked if Stackhouse had ever attended a meeting or filed any research. Wendell's pause was its own answer. The filing would go to the county commission. A hearing had been scheduled for the 3rd week of March. Cecilia set the papers on the counter beside the earlier ones. The stack was getting substantial. She looked at it for a moment with the expression of a woman who had been adding to a pile her whole life with the understanding that the pile never stopped the work. She called Wendell. Wendell Cobb's research method was not efficient by the standards of digital information retrieval, but it was thorough in a way that digital systems could not replicate, because the records he worked with had never been digitized, had in many cases never been fully cataloged, existed in the county recorder's archive as physical documents filed in the order of their recording and accessible only to someone who knew what they were looking for, well enough to recognize it when it arrived in a different form than expected. He worked the archive for 2 weeks. He pulled the original land grant records for the Carson property, the chain of title from the initial patent forward, the estate records from the period when the Carson family's line had ended. He found what he was looking for in the estate file from 1931 the death record for Edna Mae Carson recorded as the sole surviving heir of Clarence and Ruth Carson, with an attached notation from the county probate judge indicating no surviving heirs, the estate to pass through standard intestate process. Edna Mae Carson had no children. She had no siblings. The Carson family line ended with her documented by the county, confirmed by the probate filing, attested to by 2 county witnesses whose signatures were legible on the bottom of the form. Gaines had no connection to the Carson family. The co-petitioner Stackhouse had no connection to the Carson family. The public conservation claim was a legal construction, not a historical one designed to create leverage rather than to protect anything. It would not survive a commission hearing if the actual historical record was present in the room. But Wendell had found something else in the archive, something he had not been looking for, which is often where the significant findings occur. Attached to the original land patent filed with the county recorder in 1887 was a survey description. It referenced several permanent features of the property as boundary markers and as documented improvements. Among them, the surveyor had noted 1 stone well hand-cut limestone construction located on the northeast slope of the described parcel depth, approximately 50 feet water-bearing formation, present at 40 feet depth, established prior to the survey date by an unknown period. Prior to 1887, the well was older than the Carson family's formal ownership. It had existed before they filed the land patent. It had been there when they arrived, part of what they found and incorporated into the homestead they built. The Carson well was not named for the Carsons. It was named by the Carsons because it was already there, already holding water, already doing the work it continued to do today. Wendell drove to the ranch on a Saturday morning with the photocopies. He spread them on the tailgate with his usual careful hands, the documents inside archival sleeves to protect them from the February cold. He explained what he had found. Cecilia listened without interrupting. "How old is it?" Everett asked. Wendell looked at the survey document at the handwriting of a 19th century surveyor who had noted the well without knowing what question he was answering for a future he couldn't have imagined. "Older than anything we can confidently date. The county's geological survey suggests this part of the aquifer has been accessible through hand-dug construction since at least the early 1800s. If the well predates the 1887 patent by a meaningful period," he paused, "it's possible it's 200 years old. It's possible it's older." The cold air moved across the tailgate. The documents didn't stir inside their sleeves. Cecilia looked at the survey description, at the careful handwriting, at the notation made by a man doing his job on a fall morning in 1887, doing it well enough that the words survived to matter now. "This goes to the commission hearing," she said. The spring house appeared on the 15th of March, 11 days before the commission hearing. The goats had been working the section below the well since late February, a dense thicket of old blackberry cane. The kind of cane that had layered over itself so many times that the outer growth was rooted in the debris of previous growth rather than in the soil. The whole mass elevated several inches above the actual ground level. It came apart differently than the earlier thickets, more structurally complex, requiring the goats to work from the top down rather than pushing through. They managed it the way they managed everything, with the patience of animals that have no investment in speed. Everett was in that section on a Tuesday afternoon when the ground changed under his feet. He had been moving along the section's inner boundary, checking the browse pressure in the thicket's core, when his right boot dropped 2 inches into a gap that shouldn't have been there. He stepped back. The gap was rectangular, covered by a thin layer of debris and the compressed root mat of the overlying blackberry. He cleared the debris. Stone. A threshold stone flat, beveled at the entry edge, the kind of stone that marks a doorway in a structure built to have a floor level slightly above grade. He called for Cecilia, and the 2 of them worked the area for the rest of the afternoon, moving carefully, reading the ground before removing anything. What emerged was a foundation. Stone laid dry mortared with clay, rectangular, approximately 12 feet by 8 feet, the corners square to within a tolerance that suggested the person who built it had used a plumb line and a level, even if those instruments were handmade. The walls had collapsed inward at some point, probably decades ago, the upper stone courses folding into the interior space, but the foundation courses remained 2 to 3 courses high all the way around the outline of the structure, as legible as a floor plan. The spring house. The building that Wendell's aerial photographs had shown in the cluster of structures below the well. The building that the original homestead had used to keep dairy and stored goods cool by channeling the cold air that rose from below the water table. the kind of building that farms in that region built within proximity of their wells for exactly that purpose. Wendell confirmed it the following morning. He walked the perimeter twice, measured the interior dimensions, with a tape compared them to the shadow dimensions he had extrapolated from the 1954 aerial photograph. Within the margin of aerial photographic measurement, they matched. Inside the collapsed interior, under the fallen stone courses, Everett found the box on the second afternoon of clearing. It was wooden, constructed from lumber that had been milled rather than hand-hewn, which placed its manufacture sometime after the mid-19th century introduction of milled lumber to the region. The exterior had been wrapped in what appeared to be tin sheeting, fitted and crimped at the seams in the manner of a person who wanted to protect the interior from moisture infiltration. The tin had corroded in places, the surface taking on the gray-brown of oxidized metal, but the crimped seams had held. The box had not flooded. Everett carried it out of the spring house foundation without opening it. He set it on the cleared ground outside, away from the debris. He waited for Cecilia. She came from the upper section where she had been monitoring the goats near the well. She looked at the box on the ground, at the tin wrapping, at the care that someone had taken to make it water-resistant. She crouched beside it. The lid lifted with resistance, the friction of a joint that had been sealed for a long time and was now being asked to move. Inside, protected by a layer of oilcloth that had dried to brittleness but had held its shape, was a collection of documents. She handled the oilcloth with care, unfolding it one layer at a time until the contents were visible. The documents were organized in the way that careful people organize important papers by type. The land records together, the personal correspondence in a separate bundle, a folded map at the bottom. The land records were the ones that mattered for the commission hearing. The original property transfer, signed by the county recorder, dated 1887, carrying the signature of the Carson family patriarch and 2 county witnesses. It was the original document, not a copy, not a recorded transcript. The original with ink that had kept its black despite the decades. Beneath the land records, a bundle of letters, personal correspondence, the handwriting of several different people across a span of apparent years. Cecilia didn't read them. They weren't hers to read yet. At the bottom of the bundle, between 2 sheets of stiff cardstock that had protected it from contact with the other papers, a photograph. She held it carefully. Black and white printed on a matte surface, the edges slightly curled, but the central image clear. The stone ring of the well at the upper northeast slope, recognizable in its dimensions, its construction quality obvious, even in the flattened tones of the photograph. Beside the well, 3 children in clothing that placed the image in the last decade of the 19th century, their faces turned toward the camera with the self-conscious stillness that early photography required. 2 of them held wooden buckets. One of them had an arm extended toward the well rim, caught mid-motion. On the back in pencil, the handwriting of someone who expected to know what the photograph showed, but wanted the record to be clear for anyone who came after Carson. Well, summer of 1894. Cecilia turned the photograph over again. She looked at the children, at the well, at the light in the image. That was the same light that fell on the same stone ring every morning when it wasn't clouded. The continuity of it moved through her in the way that certain realizations move through a person who has been patient long enough to see how the pieces fit. She set the photograph carefully beside the documents on the clear ground. The afternoon light was going gold across the ridge. Wow! The commission hearing took 45 minutes. Wendell Cobb presented the historical record, the original land patent, the 1887 survey notation establishing the well's pre-Carson existence, the 1931 probate record confirming the extinction of the Carson line, the original transfer document from the tin box, the chain of title from the probate through the county tax authority through the auction at which Cecilia Marsh had legally acquired the property. Gaines's attorney made his public conservation argument. The commission chair, a woman named Frances Aldrich, who had been on the county commission for 16 years, listened to the argument in its entirety without expression. Then she asked a question: could the petitioner identify any specific legal mechanism under county ordinance that established a public conservation claim on private property without the property owner's consent outside the eminent domain process, without compensation? The attorney consulted his notes. He offered 2 citations. The commission's legal counsel, a man who had been doing county law for 23 years, addressed both citations in sequence. Neither applied to the situation described. One referenced public easements on navigable waterways. The other referenced historic district designations which required the consent of property owners within the district which Cecilia had not given. Francis Aldrich called for a vote. The commission declined the petition 4-1, the single dissenting vote belonging to a commissioner who had received 2 calls from Gaines's office in the preceding week, a fact that was not relevant to the proceeding, but was noted by several people in the room. Gaines was not present at the hearing. He had sent his attorney. When the attorney called him from the parking lot, afterward, the call lasted less than 3 minutes. Whatever recalculation was occurring on Gaines's end of the line, it didn't extend to further legal action. The county court records would show no subsequent filing under his name related to Parcel 19. Cecilia drove home through the late afternoon light. She didn't celebrate not because the outcome was insufficient, but because celebration was not her response to things going the way they should. The commission had recognized what the record said. The record said what it said because Wendell had found it, because the spring house had revealed it, because the tin box had held it, because someone in 1887 had filed the original document correctly, and someone else in the same year had noted a well on the northeast slope of a property being surveyed, and someone else entirely in 1894 had thought to write on the back of a photograph so that whoever came after would know what they were looking at. The land had kept its own record. She had only needed to clear away what was hiding it. The summer that followed was dry. Not catastrophically dry, not the kind of drought that makes national weather coverage, but persistently, stubbornly dry, in the way that the region's summers had been trending for years drier each year, by a small increment that added up over a decade to something meaningful. The forecast every week carried the same update: below average precipitation, above average temperatures, no significant rainfall expected through the end of the month. The county's pastures showed the summer's character in June. By July, they were explicit about it. Harlan Dillard's north field, which he ran with a herd of 30 Angus on a fixed rotation that hadn't changed in 2 decades, went brown in the second week of July. His south field followed within 10 days. He moved the herd to the river pasture, which had some residual moisture from the spring, but even that was showing the beginning of the dry season thinning by the end of the month. His east field, which bordered the county road, shared that road with the western edge of Parcel 19. He drove past on a Monday morning in late July with the specific attention of a man comparing 2 adjacent situations that had arrived at different conclusions. On his side of the road, the eastfield grass was the color of late summer. Everywhere the straw tan of dormant fescue, the curled edges of heat-stressed blades, the open bare ground between grass clumps that appears when moisture deficit has been sustained long enough. On the other side of the road across the fence line of Parcel 19, the recovered native pasture on the south slope held a color that his field did not. Not deep green, not the exaggerated green of irrigated land, but a muted living green, the color of grass that is under stress, but has not surrendered to it the color of grass, with access to something his field's grass did not have. He drove on. He came back in the afternoon when the light was different, when he couldn't argue with the comparison as easily. The difference was still there. The native grass species that had emerged from the seed bank, the side oats grama, the little blue stem, the pasture sedge, were deep-rooted in, the way that native grasses are deep-rooted, their systems extending down through the soil profile to depths that introduced fescue and Bermuda grass didn't reach. In a normal year, the advantage was modest. In a dry year, it was visible from a county road. But the native root systems weren't the only explanation. The gravity-fed pipe that Cecilia had run from the well down the stone channel, then extended in black poly tubing from the channel's terminus to a small livestock trough in the lower south paddock, was delivering water to the stock consistently. No pump, no electricity. The elevation differential between the wellhead and the trough was 42 feet of vertical drop over 310 yards of lateral distance. That grade was enough. It had always been enough. The person who built the stone channel in the 1880s had known that, had done the calculation in their head using knowledge accumulated through experience rather than engineering school, had set the stones on the right grade and let gravity do the arithmetic. The trough filled steadily through the dry summer days. Clear water, cold enough to feel like something from underground, which it was. The goats drank from it. The cattle Cecilia had introduced to the south paddocks drank from it. Not one drop required an electrical grid or a diesel tank. The county's agricultural water specialist, a woman named Pamela Durst, who served a 4-county region from an extension office 2 towns over, had heard about the well from Todd Halbrook's extended notes in June. She arranged a site visit for late July, which turned out to be ideal timing given the drought conditions that made the well's performance observable against a regional baseline of stress. She spent 4 hours on the property measuring, testing, observing. She lowered a water quality probe into the well to measure depth temperature, dissolved minerals, turbidity. She timed the flow rate at the trough outlet, measuring volume over a fixed interval and calculating the daily delivery capacity of the gravity system. She tested the water quality 3 times at 3-hour intervals to determine whether the flow rate was depleting the well's supply level. It was not. The well's water level remained constant across all 3 measurements within an inch of variation, which fell within the instrument's margin of error. The aquifer feeding the well was recharging at a rate at minimum equal to the draw. In practice, given the cold temperature of the water, which indicated deep aquifer origin rather than shallow perch water, the recharge rate likely exceeded the current draw by a substantial margin. Pamela Durst sat on the tailgate of her truck for a few minutes when she was done looking at the numbers. She had been a water specialist for 19 years. She had assessed wells across 4 counties, ranging from modern drilled wells with electric submersible pumps to hand-dug agricultural wells of various historical periods. This was the first hand-dug pre-1887 well she had assessed that was not only structurally intact but hydrologically functional at full capacity. She looked at Cecilia. "Have you calculated what this system can support?" Cecilia told her what she had calculated: the current stock numbers, the paddock acreage, the daily water requirement per animal unit, the trough delivery rate against those requirements. Her numbers showed the current system was delivering approximately 60% of daily stock water needs through gravity alone, supplemented by a catchment cistern she had installed at the low end of the springhouse foundation for rainwater collection. Pamela Durst shook her head slowly, not in disagreement. "You're underutilizing it. The recharge rate on this well supports significantly more draw than you're currently taking. If you extended the gravity system to the upper paddocks using the existing ridge topography—" She looked at the ridge at the stone channel running below it, at the poly-tubing extension Cecilia had run from the channel end. "You could water the entire 63 acres through gravity alone. Every paddock, every trough, every section. No pump, no fuel, no electrical cost. Year-round." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of an implication settling into its full dimensions. Everett was standing near the truck. He had been quiet through most of Pamela Durst's visit, listening with the focused attention of a man who has learned that the most important information often arrives without announcing itself. He looked at the wellhead at the trough at the green south slope, holding its color through the dry summer while every neighboring field showed its stress. "The oldest system on the property," he said half to himself. Then looking at the numbers on Pamela's clipboard, "the cheapest too." Pamela Durst closed her notebook. "In 30 years of waterwork, I have never filed an assessment report that recommended a client reduce their infrastructure investment to zero and rely on a pre-Civil War well." She paused. "I'm going to file one now." Harlan Dillard came on a Wednesday evening in August unannounced, which was the only way he knew how to do things that required some personal courage to do. He drove through the main ranch gate, followed the lane to the house parked, got out. Cecilia was coming from the direction of the well ridge when she saw his truck. He walked out to meet her at the edge of the yard. He had the specific body language of a man who has rehearsed something on the drive over and has now arrived and finds the rehearsal inadequate. He didn't start with the speech he had prepared. He pointed across the county road toward his east field, visible as a brown-tan expanse in the late afternoon light. Then he looked at the south slope of Parcel 19, which was not that color. "I've been driving past that fence line for 30 years, he said. His voice had the quality that voices get when a man is saying something he would rather not have to say and has decided that integrity requires saying it anyway. "I know this piece of ground. I watched it go under. I was at the auction." He stopped. Cecilia waited. "I remember what I said to you on the courthouse sidewalk." The words came out with the weight of things given up rather than offered. "I remember what I said in the coffee shop." Another stop. "I was wrong. Not wrong in the small way, not wrong about a detail. Wrong about the thing itself. Wrong about what the land was, what it could be, what a woman of 68 with a notebook and a trailer of goats could see that he had not seen in 41 years of farming the same county." Cecilia looked at him without any of the expressions that the moment might have invited: no satisfaction, no grace offering. She looked at him the way she looked at a fence line or a soil sample directly without softening the observation with sentiment. You were looking at what was there, she said. I was looking at what was underneath. Those aren't the same problem. He nodded once, not relieved, the nodding of a man accepting an accounting. They stood in the evening quiet for a moment. The light was going horizontal across the hills, touching the upper slope where the well sat behind its restored stone ring, finding the orchard below it, moving down the stone channel course to the trough, where two goats were drinking with complete indifference to anything happening at the human level. How are those 15 trees doing? Harlan asked. Every one of them produced fruit this year. He exhaled. I'll be damned. He drove back out the lane in the fading light. Cecilia watched the truck go, then turned toward the ridge where the evening color was doing its best work on the limestone outcroppings. The County Conservation District organized the field day for the third Saturday in September, when the summer's heat had broken and the county's fields were moving into the dry grass transition of early fall that made the contrast between recovered and unrecovered land most visible. The flyer listed the subject as Innovative Brush Management through Managed Browse with a secondary note about native grass restoration. It went to every farming household in the county, to the Extension Office's mailing list, to the agricultural lender networks. 214 people registered. They came in trucks and in small farm sedans and in two vehicles with university plates. They came from across the county, from two adjacent counties, from distances that suggested the flyer had traveled further than the county mailing list. They parked along the county road and the ranch lane and the cleared track that now ran all the way to the upper ridge without the resistance it had offered the previous spring. Cecilia led the tour herself. She did not use a microphone or a prepared text. She walked, stopped, spoke to what was in front of them, walked again. The group followed. The county was there. Todd Halbrook from Extension, Pamela Durst from the Water Office, Francis Aldrich from the Commission, who had brought two of the other commissioners. Wendell Cobb came. He stayed at the back of the group, occasionally providing dates or historical context when Cecilia's account moved through the historical layers, but mostly he simply walked with the others and listened. Harlan Dillard came. He stood near the front of the group for the first part of the tour and near the middle for the rest of it, which was the positioning of a man who wants to pay attention but doesn't want to be conspicuous about it. At the orchard, the group went quiet. 15 apple trees standing in the September light, their canopy open and breathing the fruit small and abundant and colored with the honest complexity of fruit grown without management for its appearance. Several people reached up to take an apple. The taste was what it always was, sharp, then sweet, then something underneath both that didn't have a single word. Wendell stood beneath the largest tree and told the group what he had found in the archives, the 1897 census listing orchard production, the aerial photographs, the stone channel, the pre-1887 well notation in the surveyor's record. He kept it factual, the way he kept everything factual, because the facts were sufficient. At the restored well, the group gathered in a circle around the stone ring. The ring stood clean in the September light, the limestone courses, even the surface of the well, head swept of debris that morning. From the center of the circle, cool air was visible as the faintest movement, the kind of thermal drift that cameras might capture, but eyes almost miss. A young farmer near the front of the group raised his hand. He was wearing the expression of someone who has been waiting for the right moment to ask the thing he came to ask. What was the biggest discovery? The thing you didn't expect? Several heads turned toward the well. The answer was obvious or seemed obvious. The ancient stone structure drawing water from an aquifer that had been serving this land before anyone present had been born. Cecilia looked at the well for a moment. Then she turned slowly and looked at the surrounding hills. The south slope fully recovered native grass rolling from the cleared cedar structure to the fence line. The orchard ridge. The drainage swale with its recovered grass, the subtle topography of the land now readable in a way it had not been when she bought it. The stone channel course running from the well toward the orchard below. The restored spring house foundation with its doorway threshold stone exposed. The old fence rows, the survey markers, the wagon trace. She turned back to the group. The grass, she said. The word landed with less than the weight people had expected. Several faces showed the recalibration of expectation. She let the quiet hold for a moment before she continued. The well is extraordinary. The orchard is extraordinary. The stone channel is a piece of engineering that most people will never see anything like again. She paused. But none of those things work without the grass. The grass is what the soil was keeping the whole time. 40 years under a cedar canopy without light, without grazing pressure, without anything except the patience of seed and ground that remembered what it was supposed to grow. She looked out at the hills again. Land doesn't forget, it waits. The brush was hiding the light from it, and the light was what it needed. Everything else we found was already there. We just needed to let the land breathe long enough to show us. The 214 people who had come to learn about goat browse management stood on an eastern county hillside in September light and were quiet for longer than such groups usually stay quiet. The state agricultural department sent a letter in October. It was formal in language and informal in spirit, which is the register that agricultural letters occupy when they are trying to acknowledge something that the forms weren't designed to acknowledge. It informed Cecilia Marsh that the Marsh Ranch Browse Restoration Project on Parcel 19 had been selected for the department's annual Innovative Practice Recognition, which came with a plaque and an invitation to present at the following spring's State Agricultural Conference. She read the letter, set it on the counter, went out to check the upper paddock rotation. The recognition was accurate. It was also beside the point. University researchers arrived in November, 2 of them from the state's Agricultural Extension Program, carrying sampling equipment and recording forms. They documented the native grass species recovery, 14 species identified in the restored sections, including 3 that were listed as uncommon in the county's current vegetation surveys. They took soil cores and sent them for carbon analysis. They photographed the stone channel, measured its grade with instruments more precise than the ones its builder had used, and confirmed that the grade was within acceptable parameters for functional gravity irrigation by pre-modern standards. They would publish a paper. The paper would circulate in the extension system. The Parcel 19 restoration would become a case study, the kind of reference that specialists mention in seminars when they are making the argument that degraded pasture land is rarely as lost as it appears. Bird populations returned to the property in numbers that wildlife observers who came out from the State University in October documented formally for the first time. Quail nested in the bunch grass at the south slope margin. Turkeys moved through the orchard. A pair of red-tailed hawks established a territory centered on the upper ridge visible most mornings from the well site, riding the thermals that form where the restored open land met the tree line. The goats remained. They were working a new section now on a neighboring parcel that Cecilia had entered into a browse contract with the owner, a retired farmer who had been watching the Parcel 19 recovery from his porch across the creek and had finally made the call. The rate of the operation covered the goats' feed costs and added to the marsh operations revenue. The work they had done on Parcel 19 had not only recovered the land, it had established a method. On a Saturday morning in late October, Cecilia carried the tin box from the kitchen table where it had been sitting since the springhouse excavation, walked across the cleared ground to the springhouse foundation, set the box on the threshold stone, and spent the better part of an hour completing the project she had started in February. The springhouse foundation had received a new timber frame roof structure in August, simple, proportional to the foundation dimensions, using materials that matched the period without attempting to replicate it precisely. The interior remained open to weather on 3 sides, as spring houses are traditionally open the roof, providing cover without enclosure. Inside, on a shallow shelf, Everett had built into the north wall using lumber milled from cedar that had come off the property in the browse clearing. She had placed a few objects, a hand-forged hinge they had found in the debris of the old fence line, a limestone block from the restoration that had proved too irregular for the wall, but too interesting to discard, a piece of the old cast-iron wagon hardware that had surfaced in the east section. She set the tin box on the shelf. She opened it, took out the photograph, held it in the October light. The photograph had not changed. The children at the well, their wooden buckets, the handwriting on the back. Carson Well, summer of 1894. A day that had been an ordinary day for them, an afternoon's work. The well delivering what it always delivered, the buckets going down empty and coming up full. The same transaction that had been occurring at that stone ring since before the Carson family had arrived. She set the photograph on the shelf, leaning it against the back wall, the image facing outward. The photograph belonged to the springhouse, not because it documented the property's history, which it did, Not because it would increase the land's appraised value, which it would not, because it completed the record that the land had been keeping all along. The land had held the box had held the photograph held the day, everything in sequence, everything in its place. Everett came around the corner of the spring house and found her there. He looked at the shelf at the photograph, at the objects assembled on the cedar planking. He stood in the doorway, opening without speaking for a moment. Gaines's firm sold his office property in town last month, he said. Moved the operation to the city. Cecilia did not respond to this with satisfaction. She looked at the photograph on the shelf at the children, who had no idea that 130 years later, a woman would stand in what remained of the building that had stood where this shelf now stood, looking at the evidence that they had lived and worked here. He wanted something he could turn, she said. This land doesn't turn anymore. The October morning was clear in the way that fall mornings are clear. A clarity that has nothing to do with the absence of clouds and everything to do with the quality of light at a certain angle in a certain season. It came through the open sides of the spring house and found the shelf and the photograph and the objects on it touching each one with the same attention. Outside, the goats moved through the east section of the upper paddocks, working with the methodical industry they had brought to this land from the first day. The stone channel ran its quiet course down the ridge. The well delivered what it always delivered. The orchard stood in the upper light with the composure of things that have outlasted what tried to eliminate them. Cecilia stood in the spring house doorway and looked out at the 63 acres that no one had wanted on the morning she raised her hand. The hills rolled from the county road to the upper ridge in the unbroken continuity of recovered land, the kind of wholeness that doesn't come from repair, but from release from the removal of what was preventing the thing from being what it already knew how to be. She had come to find out what was underneath. She had found the well, the orchard, the channel, the spring house, the photograph, the documents, the grass, the seed bank, the returning birds, the restored topography of a landscape that had spent 40 years holding itself ready. Some things are lost. The land had shown her with the specificity of a teacher who has been waiting for the right student that this particular truth requires careful application. Abandoned is not the same as gone. Overgrown is not the same as dead. 40 years of neglect is not the same as 40 years of erasure. The land had known how to heal itself from the first morning she walked it. It had simply needed someone patient enough to move the brush.